For nearly 2 centuries, the Galactic Council Forum had served as the political heart of known space. It was not a planet, nor a traditional station, but an immense artificial ring built around the quiet star Valaris 3. From a distance, the structure looked like a thin band of silver light, orbiting with deliberate precision. Up close, its scale was almost difficult to comprehend. The Forum was a city, a fortress, and a diplomatic archive all at once. Thousands of alien civilizations maintained representation there. Delegates traveled from star systems scattered across hundreds of light-years, bringing trade proposals, border disputes, military intelligence, and occasionally desperate pleas for assistance. Over time, the Forum had become something more than a council chamber. It was the central nervous system of the galactic community. Inside its vast corridors, languages from hundreds of species flowed together through translation systems. Gravity levels shifted gradually between sectors to accommodate different physiologies. Atmospheric chambers held carefully balanced gas mixtures for species that breathed methane, ammonia, oxygen, or stranger compounds. Yet despite all of that diversity, the Council functioned with remarkable order. Every species understood that the Forum existed for one reason: stability. Wars between advanced civilizations could devastate entire regions of space. The Council's role was to prevent that whenever possible. Among the representatives stationed there was one of the newest members of the galactic community: humanity. Compared to many Council civilizations, humans were recent arrivals to interstellar affairs. Their first faster-than-light jump had occurred only a few centuries earlier, a brief moment by galactic standards. While other species had explored space for thousands of years, humanity was still expanding beyond its home sector. Their territory was modest. Their fleet strength respectable but far from dominant. Their history, however, had already attracted attention. When humans first established diplomatic contact with the Council, analysts across dozens of species began studying them closely. Earth's archives were unusually complete. Human governments had preserved extensive records of their wars, alliances, and technological development. Those records revealed a civilization shaped by conflict, but also by adaptation. Unlike some species that evolved under stable planetary conditions, humanity had developed on a world defined by unpredictable environments. Their climate shifted dramatically across regions. Natural disasters occurred with uncomfortable frequency. Political systems had changed repeatedly throughout their early history. Humans survived by adjusting quickly. That trait fascinated many Council observers. Still, curiosity did not immediately translate into influence. In the early years after joining the Council, humanity rarely led debates or proposed sweeping policy changes. Their diplomats attended meetings, listened carefully, and participated in discussions only when directly asked. Within the Forum chambers, the human delegation soon gained a reputation. They were known as the quiet species. The Council chamber itself was an engineering marvel. It formed a massive amphitheater nearly 2 kilometers across. Hundreds of platforms floated at different heights within the chamber, each one designed to support a delegation from a particular civilization. Species with aquatic biology spoke from transparent water spheres. Massive gravity-adapted delegates stood upon reinforced platforms designed to support their weight. Others communicated through holographic projections, their physical bodies remaining far away. The human delegation occupied one of the mid-level platforms. It was a simple space by Council standards. A curved table, a few seating positions, and a modest array of translation equipment. The humans rarely required more. Ambassador Elena Rios had led the delegation for nearly 8 years. She was not physically imposing by galactic standards. Most Council species were larger than humans, some dramatically so. A few stood nearly 4 meters tall or possessed armored exoskeletons that could resist small arms fire. But physical size meant little in the Council. What mattered was influence. And influence came from understanding the complex network of alliances that connected hundreds of star systems. Ambassador Rios had proven to be remarkably skilled at navigating those relationships. She spoke rarely during open debates, but when she did, the chamber usually listened. Not because humans carried overwhelming power, but because their statements tended to be precise. Humans did not waste words. More importantly, they asked questions that many species had not considered. During discussions of trade routes, the human delegation often requested detailed information about transport security. When the Council debated border agreements between rival civilizations, the humans quietly studied the logistics of fleet deployments and communication networks. Military analysts across the Forum began to notice something. Human diplomats seemed unusually interested in defense infrastructure. They studied the placement of early warning systems along the frontier regions of Council space. They requested data about response times between fleet bases and vulnerable colonies. They analyzed evacuation protocols for civilian populations. At first these questions appeared harmless. After all, humanity maintained several colonies near the outer edges of mapped space. Concern about defensive readiness was perfectly reasonable for a young civilization expanding into uncertain territory. Still, over time a pattern emerged. Humans rarely argued emotionally during Council debates. They approached every issue as if it were part of a much larger system. Some species admired this methodical approach. Others found it unsettling. One of the oldest Council members, the Thero Collective, had been studying human behavior closely since their arrival. The Thero were ancient even by galactic standards. Their civilization had maintained interstellar travel for nearly 5,000 years. From their perspective, humanity was still in its infancy. Yet Thero analysts had begun submitting unusual reports to their leadership. Humans, they noted, were learning very quickly. Council meetings provided a steady stream of strategic information. Every debate revealed how different species reacted to crises. Every policy vote exposed hidden alliances. Human diplomats attended nearly all of these sessions. And they listened carefully. The forum's observation archives recorded thousands of hours of Council proceedings. Delegates frequently came and went depending on the topic being discussed. The human delegation rarely missed a meeting. Even during discussions that seemed unrelated to their own territory, humans remained present. They studied how large civilizations coordinated fleet logistics across multiple star systems. They analyzed the political friction between rival powers. They quietly built a comprehensive understanding of how the galactic community functioned. Some species dismissed this behavior as simple curiosity. Others suspected something more deliberate. Within the diplomatic district of the forum, informal gatherings were common. Delegates often met outside official sessions to exchange information over shared meals or cultural exhibitions. Human representatives participated in these meetings with calm professionalism. They were polite, observant, occasionally humorous. But even in casual conversation, they revealed very little about their long-term intentions. This restraint was unusual. Many younger species arriving at the Council were eager to prove themselves. They made bold speeches, proposed ambitious alliances, and sometimes challenged established powers directly. Humans did none of those things. They behaved as though they were still evaluating the entire system. That patience intrigued several veteran diplomats. One evening cycle, Ambassador Rios attended a strategic roundtable hosted by the Kalari Trade Union, a species known for its expansive commercial network. The Kalari had controlled major shipping routes for centuries and maintained influence far beyond their military strength. During the discussion, a Kalari coordinator asked a question that had been circulating quietly among many delegations. "Human ambassador," the translator device projected, "your species has attended nearly every council session since joining the forum. Yet you rarely propose new initiatives. Why?" Rios considered the question for a moment before answering. "Humanity spent a long time learning how to govern a single planet," she replied calmly. "Managing relationships between hundreds of star systems is considerably more complex." Several delegates produced quiet sounds of agreement. Rios continued, "When you are new to an environment this large, it is wiser to observe before attempting to change things." The Kalari coordinator tilted its elongated head. "You are studying us." Rios did not deny it. "We are learning," she said simply. That answer spread through diplomatic circles within days. It confirmed what many observers already suspected. Humanity was not quiet because it lacked ambition. It was quiet because it was gathering information. Across the forum, analysts from multiple civilizations began reviewing human activities more carefully. They examined trade patterns between human colonies. They monitored fleet exercises conducted along humanity's outer defense network. What they discovered was not alarming, but it was impressive. Human fleet organization appeared unusually efficient for a relatively young civilization. Their supply convoys operated on tightly coordinated schedules. Their patrol ships maintained overlapping sensor coverage along frontier regions. In several instances, human vessels had responded to distress signals from non-human colonies faster than the Council's own rapid response units. Those actions earned humanity a reputation for reliability. Still, they remained a minor power compared to the ancient empires dominating Council politics. Few species believed humanity would significantly alter the balance of power within the galaxy. At least not anytime soon. Inside the vast chamber of the Galactic Council Forum, debates continued as they had for centuries. Trade disputes were negotiated. Territorial boundaries were adjusted. Defense treaties were reviewed and updated. And throughout it all, the human delegation remained quietly present. Listening. Watching. Learning. Most species barely noticed them anymore. Which was exactly how humanity preferred it. Because far beyond the diplomatic chambers of Valeri's 3, human shipyards were expanding slowly but steadily. Defense networks along their frontier systems were growing more sophisticated each year. And within the strategic command centers of Earth and its colonies, analysts were studying the same council data their diplomats had been collecting for decades. Humanity had joined the galactic community as a young civilization seeking cooperation. But they were also preparing for a future that many older species had long forgotten how to imagine. A future where the stability of the galaxy might not be as permanent as the Council believed. For now, however, the humans remained what the Forum knew them as. The quiet species. The emergency session began without warning. Across the Galactic Council Forum, diplomatic channels lit up with priority notifications. Delegates were summoned to the central chamber under Category 3 Security Protocol, a level typically reserved for events that threatened multiple star systems. Within minutes, hundreds of representatives were moving through the forum's vast corridors. The amphitheater-like council chamber slowly filled as floating platforms adjusted into position. Translation systems activated automatically, preparing to interpret hundreds of languages simultaneously. At the center of the chamber hovered a large holographic star map. It displayed the outer regions of council space. Several systems along the far frontier were highlighted in red. Those red markers were the reason for the emergency session. The first to speak was a representative of the Ledhari Strategic Union, one of the most influential powers within the council. The Ledhari were known for their analytical approach to military planning and their vast network of surveillance probes. Their delegate stood upon a reinforced platform, tall and rigid, exoskeleton reflecting the chamber lights. Council members, the translator projected evenly, 3 frontier colonies have ceased communication within the last 72 cycles. The holographic map zoomed closer. 3 star systems blinked slowly. Each of them had once hosted small settlements belonging to minor civilizations under council protection. Reconnaissance drones had already been dispatched. The images they returned were unsettling. Orbital infrastructure destroyed. Surface settlements silent. No identifiable fleet signatures remaining in the systems. It looked less like an invasion and more like something had swept through the region and erased everything in its path. Another delegate activated the next data layer. Long-range sensors had detected unusual gravitational disturbances beyond the mapped border of Council territory. The pattern suggested large-scale fleet movement emerging from deep interstellar space. No known civilization matched the energy signatures. The chamber grew noticeably quieter. Encounters with unknown species were not unprecedented. The galaxy was vast, and new civilizations occasionally appeared along unexplored sectors. But what concerned the Council was the speed and scale suggested by the sensor data. If the projections were accurate, whatever force was moving toward Council territory was large enough to threaten multiple frontier regions simultaneously. Several delegates began speaking at once. Some demanded immediate military reconnaissance. Others proposed diplomatic probes to attempt first contact. But the Ledhari delegate raised a limb for attention. There is another matter the Council must consider. The star map expanded again, revealing dozens of systems stretching across the outermost boundary of Council-controlled space. These regions, the Ledhari continued, contain over 60 colonial settlements belonging to 14 different civilizations. Many of them were small outposts, mining operations, agricultural colonies, or early-stage planetary settlements. They were lightly defended. Their distance from the major fleet bases of the core worlds made rapid reinforcement difficult. The Ledhari delegate paused before delivering the proposal. Our strategic models indicate that defending all frontier colonies simultaneously may not be feasible. A quiet ripple of tension spread through the chamber. Even before the translator finished the next sentence, several delegates already understood where the argument was heading. The Ledhari continued. To protect the stability of Council space, we recommend establishing a buffer region. The red markers on the star map expanded outward. Nearly a dozen frontier systems were suddenly highlighted. These colonies should be evacuated, the Ledhari delegate explained. Their infrastructure dismantled and defensive forces withdrawn to fortified systems closer to the Council core. The proposal was delivered calmly. clinically. But its meaning was impossible to misunderstand. The council was being asked to abandon its frontier populations. Murmurs began spreading through the chamber. For large civilizations with heavily populated home systems, the idea was uncomfortable but practical. Losing distant colonies might be a tolerable sacrifice if it prevented a larger conflict from reaching the core worlds. But for smaller species, those frontier systems represented decades of expansion. Some were their only colonies beyond their homeworld. One delegate from a minor civilization spoke first, their voice trembling through the translator field. You propose surrendering inhabited systems without resistance. The Lethari responded without hesitation. We propose preserving the stability of the majority. More data appeared on the star map. Simulated invasion routes. Fleet response times. Probability models calculated by Lethari strategic networks. The projections suggested that if the unknown force struck the outer colonies first, the Council would struggle to respond quickly enough to defend them all. However, if those regions were evacuated and converted into a buffer zone, Council fleets could consolidate their defenses around stronger positions. From a purely strategic perspective, the plan made sense. But strategy and morality rarely aligned perfectly. A representative of the Kalari Trade Union spoke next. If we abandon these systems, we signal weakness to the unknown force. Not weakness, the Lethari replied. Efficiency. Another delegate interrupted. And what of the civilians currently living there? Evacuation protocols will be implemented where possible. Where possible. The phrase echoed through the chamber. Several frontier systems were months away from the nearest Council fleet base. Transporting millions of colonists within that time frame would require enormous logistical coordination. Some settlements might not receive evacuation ships before the unknown fleet arrived. The debate grew more intense. Arguments spread across the chamber in overlapping waves of translated speech. Some civilizations supported the proposal. Others condemned it. From their platform near the center tier of the chamber, the human delegation remained silent. Ambassador Elena Rios watched the holographic map carefully. Her team had already begun running independent calculations on their portable strategic tablets. Human analysts back on Earth were receiving the same data feed in real time. Within minutes, the first results appeared. Human projections differed slightly from the Lethari models. Not drastically, but enough to raise concerns. One of Rios's advisors leaned closer. Our models show another possibility, he whispered. Rios nodded slightly but did not respond. Across the chamber, the debate continued. The Lethari proposal gained support from several major powers whose territories lay deep within Council space. For them, the buffer zone represented a practical safeguard. If the frontier fell, the core worlds would still be protected by distance and concentrated defenses. Eventually the Council moderators signaled for order. The chamber quieted. The proposal has been formally submitted, the moderator announced. Delegations may now deliver final statements before the vote. One by one, species representatives stepped forward to record their positions. Some reluctantly supported the evacuation plan. Others warned that abandoning territory could embolden an unknown enemy. Yet despite the intensity of the debate, one delegation had not yet spoken. The humans. Their silence had not gone unnoticed. Several diplomats glanced toward the mid-level platform where Ambassador Rios sat calmly reviewing her data. For decades, humanity had participated in Council discussions without attempting to dominate them. But when humans did choose to speak, their words were usually deliberate. The moderator eventually addressed the platform directly. The Human Confederation has requested a speaking slot. All attention shifted toward the human delegation. Ambassador Rios stood slowly. Her posture was relaxed, but the chamber's atmosphere shifted subtly as the translation systems locked onto her voice. The star map continued hovering in the center of the chamber, red frontier systems glowing against the darkness of space. For the first time since the emergency session began, humanity was about to enter the debate. And what they were about to say would change the tone of the entire meeting. When Ambassador Elena Rios stood, the Council chamber settled into a rare moment of quiet. Hundreds of alien delegates watched from their platforms as the human representative stepped forward to the edge of her station. The translation field adjusted automatically, projecting her voice across the enormous amphitheater. Humans were not the most powerful species in the chamber. They were not the oldest. But over the past decade, Council members had learned something about them. When humans chose to speak, they usually did so for a reason. Rios rested one hand lightly on the curved surface of the diplomatic console and looked toward the star map floating in the center of the chamber. The frontier systems still glowed in red. For a moment she simply studied them. Then she began. The Human Confederation appreciates the strategic analysis provided by the Ledhari Union, she said calmly. Her tone was steady and professional, the kind used by someone addressing colleagues rather than opponents. The disappearance of 3 colonial systems is a serious development. Humanity agrees that the Council must respond with caution and coordination. Several delegates nodded slightly. At least so far the human statement sounded supportive. But Rios continued. However, she said, after reviewing the data provided during this session, humanity cannot support the proposed abandonment of frontier systems. The chamber stirred immediately. A few representatives leaned forward. Others shifted in visible irritation. Direct disagreement was not unusual in the Council, but the human statement had cut directly against the strategic recommendation of one of the galaxy's most respected military planners. Rios remained composed. The Ledhari analysis assumes that the unknown force approaching our territory is primarily interested in territorial expansion, she explained. The star map shifted as the human console transmitted additional data overlays into the chamber's projection system. Human calculations appeared beside the original Ledhari projections. Our analysts reached a different conclusion, Rios continued. She gestured toward the 3 destroyed systems. These colonies were not occupied, she said. They were eliminated. The distinction was subtle, but it caused several observers to pause. Rios enlarged one of the reconnaissance images taken from the abandoned systems. The hologram showed the shattered remains of orbital infrastructure. There is no evidence of settlement by the unknown fleet, she said. No resource extraction. No infrastructure deployment. No communications attempts. She allowed the image to linger for a moment before continuing. This pattern does not resemble expansion. The implication slowly spread across the chamber. If the unknown force was not conquering territory, then why were they destroying it? The Ledhari delegate raised a limb. Your conclusion is speculative, the translator projected. Rios inclined her head slightly. All strategic projections contain speculation, she replied. But our concern is the signal the Council's proposal may send. She turned back to the star map and highlighted the systems proposed for evacuation. If these colonies are abandoned, she said, the unknown force will encounter minimal resistance while advancing deeper into Council territory. That is precisely the purpose of a buffer zone, another delegate interjected. To slow their advance. Rios shook her head slightly. No, she said. To simplify it. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber. The human ambassador continued before anyone could interrupt. Military history on Earth contains many examples of defensive withdrawal, she explained. Sometimes it is the correct decision. But those decisions work only when the withdrawing force maintains the initiative. She paused, letting the translation systems finish transmitting the statement to dozens of languages. If we abandon inhabited systems before the enemy even arrives, she said, we surrender that initiative. The Ledhari delegate responded quickly. You assume the Council has the capability to defend all frontier colonies simultaneously. No, Rios replied. I assume we must try. Several delegates reacted visibly to that statement. The difference between the 2 positions was not purely strategic. It was philosophical. For many older civilizations, sacrificing remote colonies to preserve the core worlds was an unpleasant but accepted reality of large-scale governance. Humanity appeared to see it differently. Rios continued speaking. Earth's early history involved multiple global conflicts, she said. In several cases, defending vulnerable populations required committing resources beyond what seemed immediately practical. Another data overlay appeared on the star map. Human fleet positions along their own frontier regions. Our analysts recommend an alternative response, she said. Instead of withdrawing from the frontier, the human proposal called for reinforcing key systems along the outer boundary of Council space. Early warning stations. Mobile defense fleets. Evacuation corridors for civilian populations. Rather than abandoning these colonies, Rios said, we should transform them into a forward defensive network. The chamber filled with overlapping reactions. Some delegates considered the proposal seriously. Others dismissed it almost immediately. One representative from a powerful inner-core civilization spoke bluntly. You propose risking Council fleets in uncertain territory to defend minor colonies belonging to weaker species. Rios answered without hesitation. Yes, The delegate made a dismissive gesture. That is not efficient strategy. The human ambassador remained calm. Efficiency is not always the same as stability. The moderator signaled for order as the chamber began to grow noisy again. Human ambassador, the moderator said, are you suggesting the council's current proposal will destabilize the region? Rios looked around the chamber. Many species were watching closely now. Yes, she said simply. If the council abandons its frontier populations, two things will happen. She raised one finger. First, any hostile force approaching our territory will learn that the outer systems are lightly defended. Another finger. Second, the civilizations living in those systems will learn that the council may not defend them when a threat appears. That statement landed heavily across the chamber. Trust was the foundation of the council's authority. The entire diplomatic system relied on smaller species believing that the organization would protect them from larger powers. If that confidence weakened, the consequences could ripple across dozens of alliances. The Lethari delegate spoke again, their tone slightly sharper. You assume the unknown fleet will interpret our actions as weakness. Rios responded evenly. Human military doctrine teaches us to assume that any intelligent adversary will analyze our behavior. The chamber fell silent again. Finally, the moderator asked the obvious question. If humanity opposes the evacuation policy, will your government commit fleets to defend those systems? It was a reasonable challenge. Supporting a strategy was one thing. Providing the resources to implement it was another. Rios did not hesitate. The Human Confederation is prepared to reinforce its own frontier regions immediately, she said. If the Council chooses to coordinate a broader defensive effort, we will participate. The answer surprised many delegates. Human fleets were capable, but not large enough to defend the entire frontier alone. Their offer suggested something else. They were willing to act even if the Council hesitated. The moderator turned back toward the chamber. The Council will now proceed to a vote on the Lethari evacuation proposal. The star map dimmed slightly as voting interfaces activated across the chamber. Delegates entered their decisions. Some reluctantly supported the evacuation. Others voted against it, persuaded by the human argument or their own political concerns. Within minutes, the results appeared. The evacuation policy passed. Not by a large margin. But enough. The Council had decided. Several frontier systems would be abandoned. For a few seconds the chamber remained quiet as delegates processed the outcome. Then something unexpected happened. On the mid-level platform, the human delegation began to stand. Ambassador Rios looked once more at the star map. Then she turned toward the moderator. Since the Council has chosen this course, she said calmly, the Human Confederation will adjust its participation in the forum accordingly. The statement caused immediate confusion. What do you mean? The moderator asked. Rios answered without raising her voice. Humanity will withdraw from the Council's Joint Strategic Command structure effective immediately. The chamber erupted in noise. Dozens of delegates began speaking at once. But the human ambassador had already finished. We appreciate the opportunity to participate in the Council, she said politely. However, our government cannot support policies that intentionally leave civilian populations without defense. She inclined her head respectfully toward the chamber. Therefore we will be returning to our fleet command networks to pursue independent defensive measures. Before anyone could respond, the human delegation turned and began leaving their platform. No dramatic gestures. No threats. Just a quiet exit. Across the Galactic Council forum, hundreds of alien diplomats watched in stunned silence as humanity walked out of the chamber. At first, many assumed it was simply a symbolic protest. But within hours, reports would begin arriving from across Council space. Reports that suggested the humans had not left the meeting in anger. They had left to begin preparing for something. For several seconds after the human delegation left their platform, the Galactic Council chamber remained unusually quiet. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of confusion. Across hundreds of floating diplomatic platforms, alien representatives exchanged uncertain glances. Translation fields hummed softly as private communication channels activated between delegations. Humanity leaving the chamber was unexpected. Humanity withdrawing from the Council's strategic command structure was something else entirely. The moderator was the first to break the silence. The Council acknowledges the position of the Human Confederation, the official announcement echoed through the amphitheater. Their decision will be recorded in the session archive. The statement was neutral as Council protocol required. But privately, Many delegates were already trying to interpret what had just happened. Most diplomatic protests followed predictable patterns. A species might temporarily suspend negotiations, delay cooperation agreements, or issue formal complaints. Walking away from the Council's joint defense structure during a developing security crisis was far less common. Some representatives assumed the humans were reacting emotionally. Others suspected something more deliberate. On one of the upper platforms, the Thero collective delegation observed the empty human station carefully. Their species had studied humanity closely since its arrival at the forum. One of the Thero analysts spoke quietly through a private channel. They did not appear surprised by the vote. Another responded. No. They appeared prepared for it. Below them, the Lethari Strategic Union delegation began reviewing the human objections again. The Lethari were not accustomed to being challenged during strategic discussions, but they respected analytical disagreement. What concerned them was not the argument, was the timing. If humanity disagreed with the evacuation strategy strongly enough to withdraw cooperation, it suggested their leadership believed the Council had made a serious mistake. Still, the vote had been completed. The policy would move forward. Within the next few days, Council fleets would begin organizing evacuation convoys for the designated frontier systems. Colonial administrations were already receiving instructions to prepare for relocation. The plan was difficult but manageable. At least, that was the assumption inside the Council chamber. Outside the forum, events were already unfolding. The first reports. The Galactic Council Forum maintained constant communication with hundreds of fleet bases and observation stations throughout known space. Roughly 2 hours after the emergency session ended, the first unusual report arrived. It came from a navigation relay near the human frontier. A cluster of human military vessels had departed their home systems at high velocity. That alone was not alarming. Fleet movements occurred regularly. What caught the attention of the monitoring officers was the scale of the deployment. Carrier groups, logistics transports, escort destroyers, all moving toward the outer edge of Council territory. Within another hour, additional reports arrived. Human fleets were mobilizing from multiple systems simultaneously. The movements were coordinated with remarkable precision. Inside the Council's Strategic Monitoring Center, analysts began assembling the incoming data. One of the junior officers turned toward his supervisor. "Is this an exercise?" The supervisor checked the communication logs. No notification from human command. Then why are they deploying? No one had an answer yet. A pattern emerges. By the time the Council reconvened for its next scheduled session, the scale of the mobilization had become impossible to ignore. A massive holographic display filled the chamber, showing ship movements across several sectors. Human vessels were appearing in system after system along the frontier. Ambassador Rios and her delegation were not present to explain. The human platform remained empty. Several delegates spoke at once. Are they ignoring the Council's evacuation order? Are they establishing independent defenses? Is this a military escalation? The Lethari delegate requested access to the data. After a brief analysis, they addressed the chamber. The deployment pattern does not indicate offensive operations. That statement eased some tension, but only slightly. Instead of concentrating forces in a single region, the human fleet movements were spread across dozens of frontier systems. Transport ships accompanied many of the formations. Reconnaissance drones were being deployed ahead of the main groups. The pattern resembled something very specific. Preparation. The Kalari Trade Union representative leaned toward the projection. They are moving into the systems the Council voted to evacuate. The realization spread quickly. Humans were not withdrawing from those regions. They were moving toward them. Messages from the frontier. Several hours later, the Council began receiving direct transmissions from colonial administrators in the threatened systems. The messages were confused at first. Many of the colonies had expected evacuation convoys from the Council fleet. Instead, the first ships arriving in orbit carried human markings. Defense frigates entered high orbit above agricultural worlds. Engineering vessels began deploying sensor buoys and communication relays. In one mining system, human technicians worked alongside local authorities to strengthen planetary shields. The messages all carried the same tone. Human fleets were not evacuating the colonies. They were fortifying them. Reaction inside the Council. Back at the forum, the chamber filled with tense discussion. Several delegates accused humanity of violating Council authority. Others argued that the humans were simply protecting their own territory. But the frontier systems in question did not belong to humanity. They belonged to smaller civilizations scattered across the outer regions. One representative from a minor species spoke with visible emotion. Human ships arrived in our system 3 hours ago. Their commander informed us that they intend to assist with civilian evacuation and orbital defense. The delegate paused before continuing. They did not request payment. The chamber grew quieter. For centuries, major powers in the galaxy had provided protection primarily within their own territories or through formal alliances. Sending fleets to defend unrelated colonies without negotiation was unusual. The Lethari delegates studied the deployment map again. They are not attempting to replace the Council's strategy, they said slowly. They are implementing a different one. The moderator turned toward the projection. What strategy? The Lethari expanded the holographic display. Human ships formed a scattered network across the frontier. Early warning sensors stretched far beyond the colonial systems. Supply convoys were establishing temporary logistics stations between the stars. They are building a forward defensive line, the Lethari concluded. The implication hung in the air. Humanity had not simply protested the Council's decision. They had acted on their own assessment of the situation. Why the walkout mattered. As the meeting continued, more reports arrived from across the frontier. Human engineers assisting with evacuation planning. Human patrol vessels scanning deep space for incoming threats. Human commanders coordinating with colonial governments that the Council had already decided to abandon. The scale of the operation was still small compared to the fleets of ancient civilizations like the Lethari or Theral. But what unsettled many observers was how quickly it had happened. Within hours of leaving the Council chamber, humanity had begun implementing a complex interstellar operation. That suggested something troubling. They had already been preparing. The Theral analyst who had spoken earlier reviewed the timeline again. Human diplomats had attended Council discussions about frontier security for years. They had studied defense infrastructure, logistics routes, and fleet coordination systems. If humanity had predicted the Council might choose evacuation, then their current actions were not improvised. They were planned. Back inside the main chamber, the moderator addressed the delegates. The Human Confederation has not violated any Council treaties, the announcement confirmed. They have simply withdrawn from the Joint Command structure, which meant the Council could not legally order them to stop. Across the chamber, diplomats began to realize something uncomfortable. Humanity had disagreed with the Council's decision. But instead of arguing further, they had simply acted. They were now building defenses in the very systems the Council had chosen to abandon. And if the unknown fleet approaching from deep space reached those systems first, then humanity would be the only force standing between it and the rest of the galaxy. For the first time since the emergency session began, several Council species began to feel something they had not expected. Not anger. Not even embarrassment. But unease. Because the quiet species that had spent decades listening in the Council chamber had just demonstrated something important. When humans decided a threat was real, they did not wait for permission to prepare for it. In the days following humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council's Strategic Command, the frontier regions of Council space began to change. At first, the transformation was subtle. Small patrol vessels appeared along the outer navigation corridors. Autonomous sensor probes were deployed beyond the boundaries of established colonies. Communication relays began linking isolated systems that had previously operated with only intermittent contact. To most observers, these actions looked routine, perhaps even insignificant. But strategic analysts watching the developments from the Council forum quickly realized something important. The human deployment was not random. It followed a pattern. A network takes shape. The first evidence appeared in the star system of Halvern II, a modest agricultural colony belonging to a minor species known as the Ivoru Cooperative. Halvern II was exactly the type of system the Council had voted to evacuate. It lay nearly 6 weeks away from the nearest major Council fleet base, with only a few small defense satellites protecting its orbital space. The colony itself housed just under 3 million civilians spread across several continents. When human ships entered the system, the Ivoru administrators assumed they were part of the evacuation effort. Instead, the fleet commander delivered a different message. Human forces would assist with civilian evacuation planning, but they would also remain in orbit to establish defensive infrastructure. Within hours, construction drones began assembling a grid of early warning satellites along the system's outer boundary. Long-range scanners were calibrated to detect high-energy propulsion signatures far beyond the range of existing Council sensors. At the same time, engineering teams reinforced Halvern II's planetary defense network. Additional shield generators were installed around population centers. Orbital traffic lanes were reorganized to allow rapid evacuation if necessary. The Ivor government transmitted a report back to the Council Forum. Their message contained equal parts relief and confusion. Human forces were not preparing to abandon the system. They were preparing to defend it. Coordination without command. Halvern 2 was not the only frontier system experiencing these changes. Across a dozen sectors, similar reports began arriving. Human patrol ships establishing sensor networks. Logistics vessels delivering supplies to colonies that had expected evacuation orders. Engineering teams reinforcing communication arrays so distant systems could share real-time intelligence. Within the Council's Strategic Monitoring Center, analysts studied the growing web of human activity. One pattern became clear quickly. The human fleets were operating without centralized command from the Council, yet their coordination appeared extremely precise. Carrier groups moved along predictable routes between systems, acting as mobile command hubs. Smaller escort ships maintained constant patrol patterns around vulnerable colonies. Behind them followed a steady flow of supply convoys, fuel, construction materials, medical equipment, even food shipments. Human planners were not just preparing for battle. They were preparing for sustainability, a different kind of military doctrine. Inside the Council Forum, representatives from several civilizations began comparing human actions with their own military strategies. The differences were striking. Many advanced species maintained powerful fleets capable of overwhelming force. Their doctrine focused on decisive engagements, large battles designed to destroy an enemy quickly. Human deployments suggested a different philosophy. Instead of concentrating ships into massive armadas, human fleets were distributed across wide areas. Each task group was smaller, but capable of operating independently. Sensor arrays linked every system together into a continuous information network. If an unknown fleet approached, the warning would travel across multiple colonies within seconds. The Thero Collective's analysts summarized the concept in a report to the Council. Human forces are establishing layered defense rather than concentrated force projection. In simpler terms, they were building a web. An invading fleet might break through one point in the network, but it would encounter resistance at every step. The role of logistics. Perhaps the most surprising element of the human response was not their warships. It was their logistics vessels. Across frontier space, enormous cargo ships began arriving in system after system. These vessels were not heavily armed, but they carried vast quantities of supplies. Construction modules. Sensor equipment. Portable habitation units. Some colonies even received spare reactor components for their aging power plants. This level of logistical preparation impressed many Council observers. Historically, logistics had been the weakness of frontier defenses. Remote colonies rarely possessed enough resources to sustain large military operations for long periods. Human planners seemed determined to eliminate that weakness. Within weeks, several frontier systems possessed supply reserves capable of supporting extended defensive operations. For the first time since the crisis began, those colonies were no longer isolated outposts. They were part of a coordinated network. Reaction from the Council. Not every Council member approved of humanity's actions. Some powerful civilizations viewed the deployment as a challenge to the Council's authority. If every species begins ignoring Council strategy, one delegate argued during a closed session, the forum will become irrelevant. Others disagreed. The humans have not violated any treaty, the Kalari representative pointed out. They have simply chosen to defend regions we decline to support. Several smaller civilizations openly praised the human response. For species whose colonies lay within the threatened frontier zone, the presence of human fleets represented something the Council's evacuation plan could not provide. Even the Lethari Strategic Union, whose evacuation proposal had triggered the disagreement, began re-evaluating their initial analysis. Their military simulations incorporated the new human defense network. The results were surprising. If the unknown fleet attacked the frontier systems directly, the human network would not necessarily stop it. But it would slow it down significantly. Instead of moving through undefended space, the invaders would encounter constant resistance. Sensor detection. Interception attempts. Evacuation corridors protecting civilian traffic. In strategic terms, the human network transformed the frontier from an empty buffer zone into a delaying field. That was the resource humanity appeared most interested in creating. The human philosophy. Weeks after the walkout, the Council Forum finally received a formal message from the Human Confederation. The transmission was not delivered in person. Instead, it arrived as a diplomatic communiqué broadcast simultaneously to every Council delegation. The message was brief. Humanity confirmed that their fleets would continue assisting frontier colonies with defensive preparations and evacuation planning. They also offered to share sensor data with any civilization operating in the region. However, the final section of the message attracted the most attention. It explained the reasoning behind their actions. Human strategic doctrine assumes that unknown threats should be met with preparation rather than retreat, the statement read. While the Council's evacuation policy prioritizes core world security, the Human Confederation believes that delaying hostile forces at the frontier increases survival probability for all civilizations. The message did not criticize the Council directly. It did not accuse anyone of cowardice or negligence. It simply described a different way of thinking about the problem. Many Council members found that explanation unsettling, because it suggested something they had not considered. Humanity had not mobilized their fleets out of anger. They had mobilized because, based on their analysis, a confrontation was inevitable. Watching the frontier. 3 weeks after the human deployments began, the network of sensors they had constructed across the frontier became fully operational. Hundreds of satellites formed overlapping detection fields stretching far beyond the colonial systems. Long-range telescopes scanned the darkness between stars. Reconnaissance drones drifted silently in deep space. For the first time since the first colonies disappeared, the Council possessed a detailed picture of what lay beyond their borders. And what those sensors eventually detected would confirm humanity's fears. But before the unknown fleet arrived, something else happened inside the Galactic Council Forum. Several senior strategists began reviewing centuries of human history. They wanted to understand why a relatively young civilization had reacted so quickly, and with such confidence, to a threat that older species still struggled to interpret. What they discovered would explain why humanity had built such an extensive defensive network. And why, when the unknown fleet finally appeared, the humans were already waiting. As humanity's defensive network across the frontier continued to expand, attention inside the Galactic Council Forum shifted from the outer colonies to the species that had chosen to defend them. For decades, humans had been a relatively minor presence within the Council. They participated in debates. They signed trade agreements. They occasionally contributed patrol ships to joint anti-piracy operations. But they had never demonstrated strategic influence on a large scale. That perception began to change once analysts started studying the full scope of the human response. At first, the Council's intelligence departments simply wanted to understand how humanity had organized such a rapid deployment. Mobilizing fleets across multiple star systems within hours required significant preparation, which raised a troubling question. How long had the humans been planning for something like this? A history of preparation. The Thero Collective was the first civilization to conduct a comprehensive review. Their analysts requested access to the extensive historical archives humanity had submitted when they first joined the Council. Those records covered thousands of years of human development on Earth, including political conflicts, technological revolutions, and global wars. The Thero had studied the archives before, but this time they approached them with a different objective. They were not looking for cultural information. They were looking for strategic patterns. Within days, the analysts began submitting reports. Human history revealed a consistent trend. Whenever humans encountered a new threat, military, environmental, or technological, they rarely relied on a single solution. Instead, they built systems designed to survive failure. Multiple communication networks, redundant supply chains, distributed command structures. The concept appeared repeatedly throughout their history. Redundancy. If one defense line collapsed, another would take its place. If a central authority lost contact with its forces, local commanders were trained to continue operating independently. This philosophy had developed through centuries of trial and error on their homeworld. And now, it seemed, humanity had applied the same thinking to interstellar defense. The Frontier Web. The Council's Strategic Monitoring Center assembled a new projection of the frontier. Human installations were highlighted in blue. What appeared on the map surprised even experienced analysts. Instead of a simple line of defenses along the outer colonies, the human network formed a layered web. Sensor arrays extended far into unclaimed space, creating early detection zones. Closer to the colonies, mobile patrol groups moved between systems in constantly shifting patterns. Behind them, logistics convoys maintained supply depots hidden within asteroid belts and uninhabited moons. Every component supported the others. If an unknown fleet destroyed one sensor station, nearby satellites would still detect the disturbance. If a patrol group was overwhelmed, reinforcement ships could arrive from neighboring systems within hours. The design was elegant in its simplicity, and deeply unsettling, because it meant humanity had anticipated the possibility of an attack on this scale long before the first colonies disappeared. Doctrine of the unexpected. The Leadhari Strategic Union, whose military planning was widely respected throughout the galaxy, began conducting simulations based on the new frontier defenses. Their models examined several possible scenarios. In one scenario, the unknown fleet attacked a lightly defended colony. In another, it attempted to bypass the frontier entirely and strike deeper systems. Each time, the human network responded in a similar way. It did not attempt to destroy the enemy immediately. Instead, it delayed them. Sensor warnings spread rapidly through the network. Civilian evacuation ships were launched along pre-planned routes. Human fleets engaged briefly before retreating towards secondary defensive positions. The result was not decisive victory, but it created time. Hours, days, sometimes weeks. In large-scale interstellar conflict, time was one of the most valuable resources a civilization could possess. And humanity had structured their entire response around creating as much of it as possible. The psychological impact. Inside the council chamber, reactions to the human strategy varied. Some species admired the efficiency of the system. Others found it unsettling. One senior diplomat from a core-world empire summarized the discomfort during a private discussion. "The humans are planning for defeat," he said. The thorough analyst listening to the conversation responded immediately. "No," the analyst corrected. "They are planning for survival." That distinction mattered. Many ancient civilizations had grown accustomed to long periods of stability. Their fleets were powerful, their territories secure. Major wars between advanced species had become rare. Human history was different. Earth's archives described a civilization that had repeatedly faced crises, sometimes from external threats, sometimes from their own internal divisions. Every time, survival had depended on adaptation. The Council's evacuation strategy assumed the frontier might be lost. Humanity's strategy assumed the frontier might fall temporarily, but it should still slow the enemy long enough for the rest of the galaxy to respond. It was not an optimistic doctrine. It was a realistic one. Decentralized command. Another discovery deepened the Council's unease. Human fleet command did not operate through a single central authority. While Earth remained the political center of the Human Confederation, operational control of many fleets had been delegated to regional commanders. Each task force possessed the authority to make independent tactical decisions if communications were disrupted. This structure differed from the rigid hierarchies used by many other species. But it had advantages. If an unknown enemy managed to disable the main communication network, human fleets would continue functioning. Each commander would already know the strategic objectives. Delay the enemy. Protect evacuation routes. Preserve civilian lives whenever possible. From a military perspective, the system was extremely resilient. From a political perspective, it revealed something important about humanity. They expected things to go wrong, and they built their systems accordingly. The quiet realization. Weeks passed as the Council continued monitoring the frontier. Human fleets remained stationed across the threatened systems. Evacuation drills were conducted on several colonies. Civilian transports practiced emergency departure routes under the supervision of human escorts. All of it seemed excessive to some observers. After all, the unknown fleet had not yet appeared. Perhaps the original colony disappearances had been an isolated incident. Perhaps the Council's evacuation plan would never need to be implemented. But deep within the strategic monitoring center of the forum, a small team of analysts kept reviewing the long-range sensor data collected by the new human satellite network. They noticed something unusual. Gravitational disturbances were increasing along the edge of mapped space. Tiny fluctuations at first, barely measurable, but growing. When they combined the data with deep space telescope readings, a faint pattern began to emerge. Something massive was moving toward Council territory. Slowly, deliberately. The analysts transmitted their findings to the Council chamber. The presentation that followed was brief. But when the final projection appeared on the holographic star map, the reaction inside the chamber was immediate. A massive cluster of unidentified vessels was approaching the frontier. The estimated fleet size was far larger than anyone had predicted, and its projected path led directly toward the systems humanity had fortified. For several long seconds no one spoke. Then the Theral analyst quietly said what many delegates were already thinking. The humans expected this. Around the chamber, diplomats began glancing at the empty platform where the human delegation had once sat. For decades, humanity had listened silently while older civilizations debated strategy and policy. They had studied every defensive doctrine the Council possessed. And when the crisis finally appeared, they had acted without hesitation. That realization caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the forum. The Council was no longer simply observing the actions of a young species. They were witnessing the preparations of a civilization that had been quietly planning for the worst. And as the unknown fleet continued advancing toward the frontier, many delegates began to feel something they had not expected when humanity first walked out of the chamber. Not irritation, not skepticism, but fear. Because the humans had clearly seen this moment coming. And if their preparations were already this extensive, it meant they believed the real confrontation was still ahead. The first confirmed contact occurred 36 days after the Council's analysts detected the growing gravitational disturbances beyond the frontier. By then, the human sensor network stretched across nearly every outer system the Council had once planned to abandon. Hundreds of long-range satellites drifted quietly in deep space, their instruments scanning the darkness between the stars. At 4:17 Standard Galactic Time, one of those sensors registered a distortion in the fabric of local space. At first, it appeared as a faint ripple, an irregular gravitational fluctuation far beyond the orbit of the outermost planets in the Halvaran sector. Within seconds, nearby satellites confirmed the anomaly. Then the readings multiplied. Dozens. Hundreds. Finally, the truth became clear. Something enormous was arriving. Emergence from dark space. Deep space around the Halvaran sector began to bend with flashes of pale energy. One by one, massive vessels dropped out of faster-than-light transit. The first ships alone were larger than most colonial stations. Then more appeared behind them. And more. Within minutes, the sensor network counted thousands of incoming objects forming organized fleet formations. The unknown armada spread outward like a dark constellation. Automated alarms triggered across the entire human defense network. From Halvaran II to the neighboring mining colonies of the Verdant Belt, warning signals activated simultaneously. On the bridge of the human carrier HCS Resolute, Admiral Daniel Kessler watched the sensor feed update in real time. His officers had been expecting this moment for weeks. Still, the scale of the fleet was larger than even the most pessimistic estimates. "Confirm fleet composition," Kessler said quietly. A tactical officer answered without looking away from the display. "Multiple capital-class vessels, sir. Unknown weapons signatures. Estimated fleet strength exceeding 2,000 major combat platforms." The admiral nodded once. "Transmit priority signal to all frontier systems." Moments later, the message spread across the human network. "Unknown hostile fleet confirmed. Defensive operations commencing. Evacuation protocols active." The first movements. The invaders advanced slowly at first, their formations expanding outward as they moved deeper into the system. They appeared confident. Perhaps even cautious. The region ahead of them was supposed to be empty. According to the Galactic Council's evacuation plan, the frontier colonies should already have been abandoned. Instead, the unknown fleet encountered something unexpected. A lattice of human sensor satellites. The first wave of alien ships destroyed several of them immediately. But the damage barely mattered. Every satellite had already transmitted the fleet's exact position to the rest of the network. Across the frontier, human commanders began implementing the next stage of their strategy. Civilian evacuation ships launched from multiple colonies simultaneously. Thousands of transport vessels moved along carefully planned routes towards safer systems deeper within Council space. Human escort ships formed protective corridors around them. The invaders had not yet fired a single shot at the colonies. But the evacuation was already underway. The first engagement. The first battle occurred less than 2 hours after the alien fleet entered the Halvaran system. A small human task group, 3 destroyers and a cruiser, intercepted the forward elements of the approaching armada. They were heavily outnumbered. The outcome of a direct fight was never in doubt. But the human ships did not attempt to destroy the enemy formation. Instead, they launched long-range missile volleys and electronic interference systems designed to disrupt targeting sensors. The alien fleet returned fire almost immediately. Within minutes, the human cruisers suffered critical damage. Yet before withdrawing, the task group achieved its objective. They forced the alien formation to slow its advance. The invaders reorganized their fleet before continuing toward the inner system. By the time they resumed full speed, another human patrol group had already begun harassing their flanks. Watching from the Council Forum. Back at the Galactic Council Forum orbiting Valeri's 3, diplomats from hundreds of civilizations gathered inside the central chamber. The massive holographic display in the center of the amphitheater showed the unfolding battle in real time. Telemetry from the human sensor network streamed directly to the Council. The scale of the alien fleet stunned the chamber. Even the most powerful civilizations present had rarely seen such a massive concentration of warships. But what truly captured the Council's attention was the human response. Instead of committing their fleets to a single decisive battle, the humans fought in brief engagements. Withdraw. Reposition. Every encounter delayed the alien fleet by minutes or hours. And every delay allowed more civilian ships to escape the frontier. A Kalari diplomat spoke softly as another wave of evacuation transports disappeared into hyperspace. They are not trying to win the battle. The Theral analyst beside them replied quietly. No. They are trying to control time. The purpose of the defense. Over the next 2 days the pattern continued. Human patrol groups intercepted the alien armada repeatedly, forcing it to adjust its course and reorganize its formations. Each encounter cost humanity ships. But the sacrifices were calculated. Sensor buoys detonated behind the retreating human vessels, flooding the region with electromagnetic interference that confused enemy targeting systems. Minefields hidden within asteroid belts forced alien ships to slow their approach. Meanwhile, the evacuation convoys continued moving deeper into Council territory. Millions of civilians left their homes under the protection of human escort fleets. For many of those colonies, it was the difference between survival and extinction. Inside the Council chamber, silence gradually replaced the earlier debates about strategy and authority. The delegates were witnessing something they had not expected. Humanity had not fortified the frontier because they believed they could defeat the invaders there. They had done it so that the enemy could not move quickly. The realization. After 48 hours of fighting, the alien fleet finally broke through the outer defense perimeter of the Halvern system. But by then nearly every civilian transport had already escaped. Human ships withdrew towards secondary defensive positions deeper along the frontier network. The invaders advanced again. And once more another group of human vessels intercepted them. The pattern repeated across multiple star systems. Delay. Evacuate. Withdraw. Watching from the forum, several council delegates began reviewing the timeline of events since the first colony disappeared. Humanity had walked out of the council chamber months earlier. Since then they had built an entire defensive web across the frontier. They had predicted the enemy's arrival with remarkable accuracy. And now they were executing a strategy designed not for glory or conquest, but for survival. Finally, the moderator of the council spoke. The Human Confederation appears to have anticipated this conflict. No one in the chamber disagreed. On the massive holographic map, the alien fleet continued pushing deeper into the frontier systems. But the path ahead of them was no longer undefended space. Every system contained human sensors, human patrol groups, human evacuation corridors. The quiet species that had once sat silently in the council chamber was now the only civilization standing between the unknown armada and the rest of the galaxy. And as the diplomats watched the battle unfold across the stars, many of them understood something that had not been obvious before. Humanity had not left the forum in anger. They had left because they knew the debate was already over. The war had simply not arrived yet.